Here we are. Apologies for the birds. Spring's coming. They know it's coming. And if you look behind me, you can see the very first buds of spring, very first buds. Now today I want to draw some interesting parallels, which I'm sure nobody else has drawn, between trade unionism and vaccination. That's right, trade unionism and vaccination. A little bit like comparing oranges and apples. The reality is there's much more in common as far as the dynamics of trade unionism and vaccination is concerned than most people realise. I mean, trade unionism developed as a mechanism by which people who only had their labour to bargain with came together to improve their social conditions, their wages, their lifestyle, life expectancy, health. And it's no exaggeration to say that hundreds of thousands of people died in struggles to create that strong trade union movement, which was, and the key word was a feature of life in Australia in the earlier parts of the 20th century. Now, as far as the English-speaking trade union movement is concerned, it wasn't until 1826 that people came together, agricultural labourers came together in order to improve their conditions, and they found themselves being deported to Australia for having the nerve to work together to collectively bargain. So what are the advantages of trade unionism? Well, trade unionism does a number of things, especially when it's effective and it covers a significant section of the population, and that's the key, a significant section of the population. When you have a strong trade union movement, you have a strong bargaining force which can extract profits from those who invest. You can extract profits. As I've said before on numerous occasions on these presentations, 40 years ago, for every dollar that an investor invested, which made a profit, 2/3 would go back to the workers who created that profit, and 1/3 would go back to the investor. Today, after the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation revolution, which has swept the world and Australia, the equation is reversed. For every dollar an investor invests, if a profit is made, 2/3 of that dollar goes back to the investor, 1/3 goes to the people doing the work. And it's no exaggeration to say, over the last 40 years, we have seen a series of legislation and a hysteria in the corporate-owned media, and to a lesser extent the government-gelded ABC, which has destroyed the ability of the trade union movement to collectively bargain and look after the interests of their people. Today, in 2021, trade unionists have almost as little power as their fellow counterparts in communist China do. It's illegal to withdraw your labour outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period after you've jumped through a number of hoops and after the Fair Work Commission has deemed that that 4-hour stoppage is acceptable. So while the trade union movement was strong, we saw an improvement in workers' conditions, we saw an improvement in wages, we saw an improvement in living standards, we saw greater pressure being placed on governments to provide services to working people. So a strong trade union movement meant an extraordinarily better society. Now what happened is that some people conscientiously objected to being members of trade unions. Fair enough. And although some sites were closed shops, many sites were not closed shops. And when a trade union movement went into a campaign, anything they won through the courts, through industrial action and through the courts and through the changes in the agreements they had with their employers, actually spilt over to all other workers in the same industry. So whether they were unionised or not unionised, If a trade union movement won a particular battle in terms of wages or conditions, that battle, the results of that battle, the spoils of that battle, were shared between all workers in that particular category. So where am I trying to go with this? Let's look at the vaccination. Now obviously in our society there are some people for a variety of reasons, mostly misguided or misinformed, who don't want to vaccinate. It's a little bit like in the past when we had people who didn't want to join the trade union movement because they had a conscientious objection to joining an organisation, whether it was religious based, whether it's personal based, whether it's a philosophical basis. But those workers enjoyed the bounty of the struggle which was carried out by everybody else in that trade union. They enjoyed that bounty, irrespective of whether they were in the trade union or not. Now, vaccination is a similar process. People talk about herd immunity. What's herd immunity and how is herd immunity created? Well, viruses and bacteria have always been part and parcel of human existence. And if you look at archaeological sites and DNA analysis and the way people died in the past, over and over and over again, we've seen huge reductions in populations due to viruses and bacteria until herd immunity is created. And what that means is that enough people have survived that particular infection to create antibodies which they will then use to deal with the infection at a later date. In the majority of cases, you'll get a reduced symptoms related to that infection. For example, when the colonised spread across the world from Europe, it wasn't their superior guns, and it wasn't their religion, and it wasn't their superior economic network which won the day. It was the disease which they carried with them, the disease to which they had developed a resistance to. And if you look at many of the early accounts of colonisation in Australia, when human hovel crossed from Sydney through Victoria up to Portland, what they noted was the smallpox scars on the faces of many Aboriginal people. And the stories they heard was of whole tribes being removed, destroyed through smallpox. And the survivors were basically a shadow of the huge number of people which inhabited the area they are traversing across. And when you look at the early accounts of colonisation in New South Wales, you'll have accounts of hundreds of bodies being left on the beaches of Aboriginal people who died from smallpox because they had no resistance to smallpox. They had no resistance to measles, they had no resistance to many of the pneumonias which were brought across, no resistance to diphtheria, no resistance to chickenpox, and there's the same story around the world. So human beings create antibodies. Large sections of the population died during a pandemic, sometimes 30, 40, 50, 60% during the bubonic plague, which swept Europe in the 16th century, 16th and 17th century. But the survivors had developed antibodies. Now, immunisation is a mechanism via which people develop antibodies. And historically, it's quite interesting that while the Europeans lagged backwards as far as immunisation was concerned, the Ottoman Empire was very aware of immunisation, and people were exposed to small doses of smallpox and they developed antibodies. And if they developed antibodies and smallpox at a later date, they had good resistance to it. And it took a while for those ideas to filter through the European theatre. So vaccination is about a quick, sure way of human beings creating antibodies. That does not mean that vaccination doesn't have risks. Obviously, every medical procedure, it's a surgical procedure, whether it's medication for an infection, whether it's medication for hypertension or any other disease, has side effects and risks, and sometimes people die from those side effects and risks. But mass vaccination is about trying to create herd immunity. What that means is, in black and white, is that for many people in the community, 80 to 90%, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, have been vaccinated. What that means is the virus basically is not able to traverse the community. And those people like myself have been vaccinated, and I've had both shots of the AstraZeneca, and I had minimal side effects. Obviously other people have had more major side effects, but I had hardly any side effects. So all those Australians who are vaccinated, we don't do it for just for ourselves. We don't do it for our community, our family, our friends, our social networks. We also, like trade unionists, we do it for those people who refuse to be vaccinated. Because the more people who become vaccinated, the greater protection for those who are not vaccinated. Except if there are large pockets of people living together who are not vaccinated. And we saw that with measles outbreaks in inner city areas in Sydney and Melbourne last year and the year before, where for some ridiculous reasons people think that somehow vaccination is akin to a death sentence. So in many ways, vaccination and trade unionism have parallel lives. The trade union movement has struggled for decades and centuries to ensure that people have basic necessities and more than basic necessities, and they share in the wealth which is created by their labour. In Australia, every time a trade union movement wins a particular struggle, and that struggle is incorporated, and the gains that are made by that struggle are incorporated into the enterprise bargaining agreement, those wins filter out to everybody in that particular group, whether they're unionised or not unionised. Unfortunately, with the so-called disruptor economy, with what I call 19th century economics, which is the virtual revolution, what we are seeing is that more and more people are being designated as individual contractors. Therefore, when a trade union wins a particular battle, all those people who are designated individual contractors who are involved in a one-to-one relationship with their employer do not benefit from that particular battle. And it's the same with vaccination. The fewer people vaccinate, the less the protection for the community. The more people who vaccinate, the greater the protection for the community. And what the trade unionism and the trade union struggle teaches us is that we can assist those who are not willing to put the effort to improve their conditions, as trade unionists do. And it's the same with vaccination. In our society, because of free vaccination, and accessible vaccination hopefully in the next 2 to 3 months, there is a great potential that 80 to 90% of the population will be vaccinated, and that 10% that does not want to be vaccinated, that has a religious objection or a moral objection or a philosophical objection or a political objection, will be protected by the efforts of all those who are vaccinated. As I said before, people who vaccinate for a variety of reasons. They vaccinate to protect themselves, they vaccinate to protect their family, they vaccinate to protect their children, they vaccinate to protect their community, their social clubs, their sporting clubs, the Australian population. But ultimately, they also vaccinate, whether they understand it or not, to protect all those people who have refused to be vaccinated. So I'd like to congratulate all those of you, like the trade unionists who fought for particular struggles which we now enjoy the fruits of. I'd like to congratulate all those of you who have vaccinated, And for a number of reasons, not just for looking after yourself and those around you, but actually for looking after those people who, for whatever reason, whether it's misinformed or misguided, or if they think it's informed, or, to protect them. Because unless we have herd immunity in this country, we will not be able to progress as a society. Even many struggles today have been put on the back burner because of the inability for people to organise during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's essential that if you're interested in struggles or involved in struggles to improve people's lives, to improve the services and conditions we work under, to improve the political process, we need to be able to put the pandemic behind us. Whether you're vaccinated or not vaccinated, we all ultimately face the same social, political, cultural, economic issues which continue to bedevil this nation of 25 million people living on a continent. So congratulations to all those of you who have vaccinated. Not only have you saved your life and the life of those around you, you have also saved the lives of those who refuse to accept COVID-19 as a reality, who refuse to be vaccinated. Like the trade unionists who worked so hard to improve the lives of not just trade unionists, but those people around them, we are doing the same. The parallels are there, they're vivid, they're real, and hopefully you will use these parallels in your discussions with your friends and families and people around you to improve the rate of vaccination in this country. Otherwise, we will continue this stop-start existence which we now are living under. Once again, it's an issue of being part of a society. Ultimately, we have responsibilities, and those responsibilities revolve around us not making the lives of those around us worse, whether it's via spreading disease, whether it's by supporting an economic system which creates poverty, whether it's by allowing a small section of society to own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, whether it's believing that corporatisation, privatisation, globalisation, deregulation will bring you forth into the land of milk and honey. Whatever it is, ultimately we have that social responsibility. And that's the history of the human race. It's not a history of just ourselves. It's a history of us living as communities in the most egalitarian way possible.